obsession. Whether it's good for you or not, your obsessions are the sort of purest form of your consciousness. They're not spiritual junk. They're the essence of who you are. Obsession is one of the only verbs that immediately implies an internal conflict. When I say obsession, what I mean is something that we're really drawn towards, and also, and interestingly, somewhat ashamed of being really drawn towards. I'm super into this thing, I shouldn't be super into this thing. And that's interesting because we're always in writing looking for the central thing we're aiming at is self-revelation, that moment where our internal sense of ourselves, the kind of dark knowledge of who we are, collides with our sort of Facebook version of ourselves. What we do is socialize people out of their obsession. We try. And so what people do is they push it down and hide it. But that doesn't make it disappear. I would argue it actually makes it more powerful, right? It's spring-loaded with the force of suppression. And for this reason, they are the substrate for most interesting pieces of writing. If you look back at the canon of books that we're still talking about and really interrogate them, even for just a sec, you'll see that obsession is at the center of most of them. This is obvious in the case of some books, right? Think about Moby Dick. Moby Dick is completely driven by Ahab's obsession, right? Everybody remember Moby Dick? There's Captain Ahab. His leg has been bitten off by a whale. He's got a prosthetic leg made out of a whale bone. And his entire raison d'etre, his reason for being, is he's going to get that fucking whale back. And he spends 500 pages getting that whale, or trying to, and dies in the process. But without that obsession, that novel is like 200 pages about whale blubber rendering. It's interesting in its setting, but it's basically a piece of nonfiction. What animates it, what makes it so fascinating is that there's this disastrous wounded male ego at the center of the book that drives us right through the whole thing. Everybody signs on for this terrible, disastrous adventure led by a deeply insecure, wounded male. Unconsciously, what's happening when you read a piece of writing is that you're trying to plug into somebody else's obsession. There is a feeling, unconscious in the reader, but powerful, that the person that's telling the story can't not tell it. They simply can't shut up about it. And that's a powerful lesson, because if they could stop writing it, why should you keep reading it? If it doesn't matter as if their life depended on it, if it doesn't have that sense of urgency, then why should the reader spend their precious hours, their limited amount of attention in the day with all these distractions swirling around, reading that particular piece of writing? Lolita is a book that is openly, from page one, about obsession, and a destructive obsession, an illicit, morally depraved obsession. But the reason that people read it isn't because we're sickos, though we are sickos, but because we all have a version of overweening love, where our desire for somebody is unwholesome and destructive to the other person and destructive to ourselves. And because we recognize that particular kind of obsession, we're interested in listening to Humbert Humbert talk about it, even though we are simultaneously disgusted, right? Maybe one way that we can concretize a little bit how obsession fits into the writer's experience and the reader's experience is to step back and say there's two questions unconsciously that a reader is asking when they enter any story. Who do I care about, and what do they care about? The more quickly we understand who we care about and the more quickly we understand what they're after, the quicker we are to emotionally and psychologically become attached to the story. What we want really is not for people, at least in the fiction and nonfiction we read, we're not interested in people's good habits of thought and feeling. We're not interested in their obedience. We're interested in the part of them that is out of control, that is openly making bad decisions. And the reason for that is simple, and it has to do with the fact that In our everyday lives as civilians, non-writers, non-artists, we are obeying a certain code that causes us to tamp down and ignore and try to hide away these unbearable feelings of desire and anxiety and doubt, right? That we feel deeply all the time. So when we turn to fiction or nonfiction, when we turn to story, we're going after that feeling that a dutiful life is depriving us of almost constantly. It's no coincidence that so many of the books that we love are centered around people behaving obsessively. All they're doing is enacting what we aren't brave enough to. Or maybe, to say it more positively, we're doing our yoga, we're living intentionally, we're trying to avoid bad decisions, good for us, but we're also in that healthy pursuit of life, kind of ignoring the deepest parts of ourselves, or some of the deepest parts of ourselves that want to make terrible decisions, right? We keep ourselves from those bad decisions, right? If we're in a long-term monogamous relationship, we keep ourselves from infidelity and that form of betrayal. But that doesn't mean we don't think about it. If we're struggling with a child who's being obstreperous, we try to be patient. We try to sort of, to set boundaries, but also love them and do what all the books say. But what do we really want to do? I want to throttle them, okay? And I'm not saying that to endorse it. I'm saying that's what's happening in our inner life. And good stories plug into that. They allow us to experience those feelings, those dire, out-of-control feelings that we're constantly suppressing in our efforts to be good citizens, good partners, good employees, good ... right? There are very few stories that are, to me, that are deeply interesting where it's sort of like, well, I was up against a challenge and I solved it. Ugh, who cares? Go tell somebody else about that. I want to hear about when you tried to solve it and it didn't work and it got worse and worse and worse, because that's the kind of sicko I am. And so are you, right? Okay, one thing to recognize is that it's much easier to write about obsessions that are in the past. And the reason is because in order to write, I think, thoughtfully and deeply and honestly about stuff that's confusing, where you have a lot of feelings, you need some distance. That's why Joan Didion in Goodbye to All That is writing about a previous era of her life, trying to make sense of her youth in New York City and the way her illusions were shattered, right? She needed the distance to be able to understand what was happening, to pluck the meaning from that rush of experience that's always coming at us. And that's what good memoirs are always doing, and good stories for that matter. The protagonist looking back on an episode that happened 20 years before that he's been unable to forget. He's only really able to look back clearly at it 20 years later. That's generally how it works with obsessive feeling, because you're so close to it and so wrapped up in it when you're currently obsessed with something that you haven't figured out fully what it means, why your mind latched onto that particular person or hobby or job possibility or ... political situation, whatever. Okay? Here's what you're going to do for the next 20 minutes or so. All I want you to do is find an obsession or recall an obsession from your childhood or adolescence. And I want you to write about it. The great advantage of being an obsessive is that you are the world's leading expert in that subject. You all grew up obsessed with one or another thing. Maybe it was a kind of fashion like tennis shoes, or maybe it was a movie character, or for my daughter, it would be Harry Potter. That's her obsession, right? She's read it 11 times. She's thought that Harry Potter's more real to her than most of her friends. Maybe it was a food. Maybe it was a particular relationship. But there's something that you, as a kid or as a young adult or an adolescent, you fixed on. And here's the one I want you to write about, the one that you feel most reluctant to write about, the one that is the most embarrassing, because that's the one that's most interesting, I promise you. All I want you to do is tell us kind of how old you were and kind of, orient us a little bit, kind of when this obsession took root. How did you commemorate your obsession? What were the rituals around your obsession? You're the world's leading expert in your obsession, so share a little bit of that with the reader. And I think you'll find, as you write more deeply into it, that your obsession might have something to do with what else was going on in your life. We latch on to things because they satisfy certain needs. They allow us to put our attention and our desire into one place, maybe as a distraction from some other place or as a way of trying to manage our feelings about what's going on in the rest of our lives. Here's the only rule on this. I do not care about your sentences. What I'm interested in is just tell me about that obsession. Get me as deeply into that little private world of your obsession as you can. Do you see what I mean? No, I'm not listening for fancy writing. That's actually almost always bad writing. I'm just listening for you guys to tell the truth about the things that matter to you. In this case, some childhood obsession or maybe adolescent obsession. Sound good? Does everybody know the one that they're going to write about? Okay, don't write about that one. Write about the other one that you're more embarrassed by. Okay? No hiding. Okay, who should we hear from? Yay, okay, good, thank you.
Right. In 1994, NBC introduced Friends and ER to the Thursday night lineup, and my mom and I were instant fans. The reviews had warned of some adult content in both shows, but that was rarely an issue for my working class single mother who used TV as a bit of a second parent, or at least as an educational tool, in that it prompted me to ask questions about what I didn't understand, which I think Mom found valuable. So we watched the shows together, the whole Thursday night lineup, but Friends and ER were our favorites. But my appreciation of ER was more specific than Mom's. For me, it was actually about Noah Wiley, aka Dr. Carter, the insecure young intern whose deep caramel eyes I longed to gaze into and whose thin wispy hair I longed to run my fingers through. I was only 11 years old, but I felt within just a few episodes of season 1 deeply in love with Dr. Carter / Noah Wiley. Either would have been fine with me. So I set to work on how to make this happen. Me and Noah Wiley becoming a couple, I mean. I truly thought this would be a possibility. You see, I also wanted to be an actress at the time, so a relationship with Noah Wiley would work doubly, not only to bring me a soulmate, but also to aid in my budding acting career, the one that I knew would bring me the kind of fame and wealth that could save me and my mom from the stuck patterns of despair that cycled through our rural working class neighborhood. To make him fall in love with me, I started learning everything about him. This was before the internet, so this meant purchasing every People magazine and Entertainment Weekly that mentioned his name. I'd scour them in line at the supermarket, and every one that had even just a line about him was enough for me to beg my mom to buy it. I also taped every episode of Entertainment Tonight, just in case he got a few minutes of airtime. This is what I learned. He was born in LA, he was a history buff, particularly interested in the Civil War, and his birthday was June 3rd. This gave me something to work with. My first attempt was to write a script about the Civil War that we'd both act in. I would be a tough as nails northern abolitionist who pretends to be a man in order to fight as a soldier for the North, and he would be a fellow soldier who realizes one day when he sees me changing in a tent that I am actually a woman, and then we'd have a steamy sex scene. As a backup, I also wrote scripts, fanfic is what we'd call it now, for ER, in which I played a prostitute who needed saving by Dr. Carter after being beat up by a John. Looking back, perhaps my mother should have censored some of our entertainment content after all. For at least 2 years, when June rolled around, I would try desperately to find his address so I could find him a birthday present. One day, in the People magazine announcement section, I learned that Noah was newly engaged to a makeup artist he met on an indie film he did called The Myth of Fingerprints. I was devastated. The pictures of him on my bedroom wall and in my middle school locker went from making me heart fluttery to heartbroken. I resented spending so much time on Civil War research when I could have been reading the fiction I preferred. And I was angry that he would no longer be my ticket out anymore.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yes. In praise of Dr. Noah Wiley. So the wonderful thing about this piece of writing, you've got a very simple, direct, funny style. We're going to become a couple, of course. On one level, there's the concrete obsession with this, movie star, TV guy, but underneath that, quite visible even to you as you write about it, is really the substrate for any interesting piece of writing, which is a protagonist who wants a bigger life, who wants out. And it's very clear in Rachel's mind, it was then, and it's even more clear now, that this was her ticket out. and that it made a certain kind of sense. He's an actor, I'm an actress, this is natural. I just got to write the script, right? This is kind of the logic of the crush. I love how you also sort of talk about the protocols of obsession. Remember, if obsession, the unit of measurement in obsession is attention, there's a tremendous amount of attention. And this piece captures something of that dynamic, but underneath that is that sense of you're looking for escape. Here's the thing that I admire so much about this, which is that Rachel's writing about the particular rituals that obtained around this obsession, but she's also cognizant that there was this other thing happening, which is she was trying to find a way out of her neighborhood and her circumstances, and not just her, she wanted to take her mom with her. The one thing I would caution you about is that you have a way of describing your mom that feels quite different, and your neighborhood that feels different from the rest of the prose. Like single working class mom, right? Single mother working class mom, or rural working class neighborhood. And it feels sociological and labeling, because, and not because that isn't accurate, it is accurate, but it takes me out of the world of the kid who's looking around and noticing in a more organic way, or beginning to notice, oh, I'm part of, like Vince Thompson, right? He doesn't say, I'm, the aggrieved white working class. But he looks around and notices the ways in which his existence is, in certain material ways, deprived compared to his companions. And so that's what I would push on a little bit harder here, is that rather than using the label, give us a sense of what your life was outside of ER, outside the dream of landing Noah Wyle and becoming a movie actress and moving out of that neighborhood. The dream's important, but also what you're escaping and dreaming.
Right. Tough Marxist habit to break. Marxist gotta.
It's a hard habit to break, yeah, by the singer-songwriter Richard Marxist. Okay. It's okay. It's a placeholder.
No, I hear you. I think,
what I mean?
Yeah, it's also academia's fault too.
Yeah, it is academic. It sounds academic, but could you hear it in your ear? That language sounded very different from the conversational language you were using when you were bringing us inside the mind and heart of that, 14-year-old girl or however. Okay. Fantastic, good. Now we know your soft spot. I am incredibly happy with how everybody wrote, because everybody did something that obsession is really the shortcut to, which is good writing resides, this is Kurt Vonnegut, not me. Good writing resides in telling the truth about what matters to you most deeply. That's why obsession is a little bit of a shortcut, because it gets you instantly back to something that matters to you so deeply you can't stop thinking about it. It's still there after all these years. It won't let you go to sleep. And it, in that sense, is like a little reminder. It's like your soul is tapping you on the shoulder and saying, actually, we've got some business to do. And it resides back here with this little health potion that's intricately linked to Noah Wyle. There he is, still dreamy-eyed. You still wish to run your fingers through his wispy hair, because he still represented a dream out. Right? And as big a life as we try to build, we're still in some part of ourselves living in the kingdom of our childhood, when we didn't have any power over who was coming and who was going, or what disaster might befall us. We couldn't fix it necessarily. And so in some sense, we still are circling around it. And obsession is just a way of identifying that so that you can start to do the hard work, which is getting it on the page, which you guys did fantastically. So congratulations. The crush as a construct, as a form of a relationship, is entirely about doomed love. It is love as an instrument of torture.